The wind howled as I crouched behind the trees at the side of the house. "I hate the cold," I muttered. But there was nothing to do but endure it. This had to be settled, regardless of the weather. The house's security system looked like a good one, but after years of working in construction, I knew something about how such systems are installed and how to breach them without triggering an alarm. It only took me a couple of minutes' work with the tools I'd purchased. Once I had a window open, I tossed the tools away and pulled out the automatic I'd bought at the gun show in Reno. I took a deep breath. It was time. "Hey, Andy, have a look at this," my wife said, handing me a glossy brochure. When I flipped it open, I saw that it was a promo piece for the Paradiso, a new luxury resort that was scheduled to open in 2 weeks on the Gulf Coast. "So?" I asked, "What about it?" She flipped the brochure open to the center, revealing an invitation for the coming weekend. "Looks pretty pricey," I said skeptically. "Oh, you can be sure about that," she said with a laugh. "It will be very pricey once the place opens. But this invitation is for a pre-launch opening, sort of a shakedown cruise, to work the bugs out before the paying customers arrive. Our agency is handling the resort's publicity, which is why I got one of these. Come on, it'll be fun. It won't cost us a dime, and it'll be good for the two of us." I had been ready to demur because my football club, that's soccer for my Anglo friends, had a match that Saturday. But Felicia's last words made me pause. After 8 years, our marriage had hit a rough stretch. Nothing serious, but uncomfortable enough that we were both aware of it. A part of the problem, of course, was my construction company, which had struggled mightily ever since the big recession hit. We'd had some lean times. We'd even had to sell the house I'd built for us and move into a small condominium to cut our monthly expenses. But we'd survived, and now business was starting to come back, which made all those long hours worth it. Thank goodness for Felicia's job. She was a vice president in the biggest PR firm in Orlando, and her ability to move seamlessly between the Anglo and Hispanic communities had made her a rising star. Of course, it didn't hurt that she had a face and figure that showcased the best of her Cuban heritage. I'm Cuban too, but I'd be the first to admit that Felicia looked way better than I. At any rate, her income kept us afloat during the depths of the recession, but her success brought increasing demands on her as well. Late nights and long hours were an all too frequent occurrence. The impact of all that was that we'd lost some of the excitement that had once enlivened our marriage. We used to spend entire weekends in bed with each other. Lately, we were lucky if we found the energy for a quickie in the evening. We'd agreed on the need to make changes and had even discussed ways to spice up our love life, but so far we hadn't done anything. So when Felicia proposed that we enjoy a long weekend together at this new resort, it occurred to me that this might be exactly what we needed to rejuvenate our marriage. The fact that she was the one to suggest it made it even more important for me to go. Besides, there was really nothing pressing at the office, and my football compañeros could do without their centrocampista for one game. Once we'd accepted the invitation, we packed our bags on Wednesday evening. I was really pleased to see Felicia pull out her skimpiest bikini along with some of her hotter lingerie. She's really going all out, I thought. On Thursday, we both got away from work early. We started out driving west until we hit Weeki Wachee, then heading north along Florida 19 past Crystal River until we saw the signs for the turnoff to the resort. "Damn," I exclaimed. "This place is out in the middle of nowhere. Why would they want to build a resort out here?" "That's the answer," Felicia said. "The developers think there's a potentially lucrative market in Gainesville that isn't being served. They're hoping to attract wealthy University of Florida alumni coming in for the home football games. It's almost impossible to find a place to stay near the campus. Why not go to a beautiful seaside resort only an hour's shuttle bus ride from the stadium? The resort has no competition. You'd have to go all the way to Clearwater to find anything comparable." "I can tell why you're such a good PR woman," I said with a smile. "I can be pretty persuasive when I want to," she said. Once we got to the resort, I had to admit that I was impressed. In addition to a series of beachfront cottages with all the amenities, the resort offered a high-rise hotel. Our room was on the 8th floor, and I was really impressed when I realized that Felicia had managed to snag us a suite with an ocean view. We unpacked our bags, then I made a call to the front desk. By the time we had changed into swimwear and were seated on the porch, a smiling young man had brought us 2 mojitos. As we basked in the sunset watching the waves coming in, I leaned back and took a long sip of my drink. "This was a great idea, Corazon. So tell me, how much would all this cost if we were paying for it?" I asked. "Let's just say that you're going to have to build a lot more buildings before we can afford to stay here on our own," she said with a grin. By the time we had finished our second mojito, I was feeling quite relaxed, and as I shifted my gaze from the beach to my wife's bikini, I began to have amorous ideas. But when I scooted my chair over next to hers and began stroking her neck, she shooed me away with mock annoyance. "Hold on there, Tigre," she said with a smile. "It's almost time for us to get cleaned up for dinner. They have 2 different restaurants here at the resort, and I want to see if they're as good as the owners say." Then she trailed her fingers across my chest. "But if you're still interested after dinner." Before I could grab her, she'd skipped away toward the walk-in shower that was big enough for 2 people. Maybe we can try that out as well this weekend, I thought to myself. This was already looking to be a very good getaway indeed. When Felicia finished with her shower, I took one as well, and after I dressed for dinner, I dropped down in front of the massive flat-screen TV to watch a Mexican football game while she did her makeup and got dressed. "Do you approve?" she asked, and I swiveled around to look. She was wearing a white silk dress that seemed to flow over her body like water, outlining her curves as it ran down them. Her jet black hair was cut very short, yet it had been styled in a way that was absolutely feminine. She had a necklace of obsidian hanging from her neck, and her 4-inch heels brought her to within an inch of my height. Magnifica was all I could say. We chose the American Grill for our first meal, and it did not disappoint. I had the T-bone and Felicia a petite filet. As we shared a slice of cheesecake for dessert, Felicia remarked, "I think this place stacks up very well with the grills we've been to in Miami." I couldn't disagree with her. When we had finished, we walked hand in hand over to the hotel nightclub, where a Latin band was playing salsa. Felicia was a better dancer than I, but it was a treat just to follow along as best I could while admiring her sinuous movement. How anyone could dance in 4-inch heels was beyond me, but Felicia made it look both graceful and sensuous. I couldn't help but be proud of the many glances she got from others in the club, both male and female. Finally, I dragged her off the floor, pretending exhaustion. "If we don't stop now, I won't have any energy for you back in the room," I told her. She quickly grabbed my hand and began tugging me toward the door. "Oh no," she said, "I have big plans for you tonight." We kissed and embraced as we rode up in the elevator, but when we got in the suite, she held up her hand to stop me. "No lights," she commanded. "Just the moon off the ocean." I hurried to comply, and when I turned around, she was standing in the center of the room facing me. She gave me a sultry little smile, then reached up and did something with her fingers. Suddenly, the white silk dress slithered down her body and pooled at her feet, revealing a gossamer bra and a tiny thong in matching white lace. She stepped out of the pool of her dress, still wearing her heels, and strode over to me like a model on the catwalk. I started to embrace her, but she pushed my hands away and began to undress me, all the while rubbing her body up against mine with feline sensuality. When she had completed her mission, she turned me and pushed me toward the king-size bed until I toppled over backward. The sex was awesome. "That was so sweet, Andres," she whispered when she pulled me up beside her. I held her in my arms for a while, and then began to caress her lightly, but she stopped me. "I'm so tired, Corazon. Let's wait till tomorrow." I smiled, pulled the covers over us, and we soon slipped off to sleep. The next morning, I went down to the beach for a jog, and when I returned and had showered, Felicia and I went down for brunch. That afternoon, we explored the property, and I was impressed by what I saw. I still wasn't sure if the venture was viable financially, but there was no question that the management intended to treat their guests to a first-class experience. Later, Felicia tried a massage at the spa while I swam laps in the pool. When she came back, she was tired, so we both took an afternoon nap. When we awoke, it was late, and by the time Felicia had put on her little black dress, the Continental restaurant was full. We had just resigned ourselves to returning to the American Grill when a man sitting with a woman at a nearby table waved at us. The man got up and walked over. "I couldn't help notice you were having difficulty getting seated. I'm Don Cavendish, and this is my wife, Mia. If you wouldn't mind dining with strangers, we'd love to have you join us at our table." I looked at Felicia questioningly, and she nodded encouragingly, so I reached out to shake hands with him. "Don, I'm Andy Salazar, and that's my wife, Felicia. We'd be delighted to accept your kind invitation." As we moved to their table, I took the opportunity to look them over. They certainly made an attractive couple. He was an Anglo about my height, maybe a few years older than Felicia and me. Mia wasn't a trophy wife, but she was definitely in MILF. Her dress featured an intriguing décolletage that drew all eyes to her impressive bosom. To put it bluntly, she was stacked and proud of it. We began to chat about ourselves and about the resort. Don and Mia had only arrived that day from Ocala, so we were able to tell them a little about what we discovered. From there, the conversation evolved into a wide variety of subjects, and by the time the tiramisu arrived, I was startled to realize that dinner had flown by. Don insisted on offering us an after-dinner cordial, and when the glasses had been distributed, he proposed a toast to making new friends in unexpected places. All of us joined in heartily. When we'd finished, Don wasn't ready for the party to end. "I hear they have a great little nightclub here. What do you say we have a dance or two?" I looked at Felicia, and she was beaming at me. "That sounds good, Don," I told him, and we were off. The nightclub was crowded when we got there, but Don must have slipped something to someone because a table big enough for the four of us magically appeared. After we'd ordered a drink, Don stood up and bowed to me. "Would you mind if I asked your beautiful wife for a dance?" he asked. "Only if you'll allow me to do the same thing with yours," I responded, and Mia gave me an encouraging look. The band tonight was playing classic rock, and all four of us began to bounce and move to the beat. After the first dance, we switched partners and went on for 2 more numbers before returning to our table to finish our drinks. I leaned over to Felicia. "Are you about ready to go?" I asked. "As I recall, we have some unfinished business back in our room." When she nodded her head, we made our excuses and prepared to leave. Don and I gave each other a man hug, then he hugged Felicia while I did the same to Mia. I thought she might have made the embrace a little tighter than mere friendship would dictate, not that I minded. Then, as we started to go, Don spoke up again. "Hey, would you two care to join us for brunch tomorrow at 11 o'clock? We're in one of the beach cottages," he gave us the number, "and we're going to eat on the patio. Can you make it?" I turned to Felicia. She whispered, "I'm really enjoying Don and Mia, and I'd love to get a peek at one of those beach cottages." I turned back to our new friends. "If you're sure it's not an imposition," I said, "we'd love to come." With that settled, we headed for the elevator bank to take us back to our room. What a pleasant surprise, Felicia exclaimed. One minute we were sitting down with complete strangers, and the next minute we were dancing with old friends. I felt the same way. I told her as I opened the door with my card key. "What did you think of Mia?" "She seemed really nice," Felicia said as she began to undress, but I didn't get a chance to talk with her at length. Then she whirled and gave me a saucy smile. "But I certainly know what you thought about her. You couldn't keep your eyes off her tits." I tried to deny it, but Felicia would have none of it. "Well, I think it's time you paid a little attention to this pair here. They may not be as big as Mia's, but I think you'll find they'll respond very nicely if you give them a kiss." That was all the excuse I needed to sweep my lusty wife into my arms and deposit her on the big bed. Neither the meal nor the dancing prevented us from some very satisfying lovemaking. It was late the next morning when we made our way over to Don and Mia's cottage. The brunch they provided was truly impressive, and dining on the large screened-in porch at the back of their cottage was delightful, especially with the breeze from the ceiling fans helping to keep the temperature down. By now, we all felt very comfortable with each other. So when Felicia and Mia made plans to work on their tans beside the resort's infinity pool, I wasn't surprised. Don had a different idea and invited me to join him on their yacht for some deep-sea fishing. Despite living in Florida my whole life, I'd done very little deep-sea fishing, and I was eager to go out with him. He and I headed down to the dock where his 38-foot Chris Craft cruiser was berthed. Don picked up a chest full of beer and ice and asked me to grab a couple of jerry cans of gasoline. "When you're out on the ocean, you can't have enough beer or gasoline," he said with a laugh. When we'd gotten several miles out in the Gulf, Don brought out the rods and baited our lines, and we began trolling. We didn't get much action, but the beer and the sea air made for a pleasant afternoon. Don was an interesting guy, and if the cottage and the cruiser weren't sufficient, his stories soon made it clear that he and Mia were loaded. Suddenly, the rod I was tending bent double and the line began to whine off the reel. "You got something," Don yelled, and helped me grab the rod. Then he took the wheel and began to steer the cruiser to help me bring whatever it was in toward me. I thought I was in pretty good shape physically, but it took everything I had just to stay in the boat. Suddenly, Don yelled, "There it is!" and I looked up to see a blue-white torpedo leap out of the water. "What is that?" I yelled, and Don came over and clapped me on the back. "Unless I miss my guess, you've hooked a mako shark, Andy." The fish jumped several more times as it struggled to get free, but I slowly made progress in reeling it in toward the boat. As it got closer, I could make out its shape swimming near the surface, and I was startled at just how large it was. I turned to Don. "Are we really going to try to land that?" I asked, but before Don could reply, the shark bit through the line and swam away. Don tried to console me on losing my shark, but frankly, I was just as glad not to get any closer than I already had to that snapping monster. I was exhausted and ready to return to the resort. When I got back to our room, I couldn't wait to tell Felicia about my big adventure, and she gave me all the right responses. But I could tell there was something on her mind, and when I had finished my one that got away account, she seized the opening. "I had a bit of an adventure myself today," she said with an expression that I couldn't quite read. When I raised my eyebrows, she went on, "Mia and I had a very interesting conversation out by the pool. She told me that she and Don like to swing sometimes." "I don't understand," I said blankly. "What do they like to swing?" Felicia looked at me like I was a naive child. "No, Andy, they're swingers. They like to swap partners for sex." "Oh," I said, as comprehension dawned on me. "Oh, wow, I would never have guessed that. But that's not all," Felicia went on with a little smile. "Mia wanted to know if we would like to swing with them tonight." I sat down abruptly on the bed. This was a lot to take in at one time. We'd only just gotten to know these people, and now they were offering to have sex with us? Mia was certainly attractive enough, but still I thought this had been a weekend for Felicia and me to reconnect. "I don't know, honey. I mean, I really like them, but this is kind of sudden. What do you think?" Now it was Felicia's turn to sit down beside me. "I think we should do it. We've been talking about trying something like this for quite a while, and we'll never have a better opportunity than now. We don't know these people that well, and we live in different cities. It's not as though we're going to be running into them all the time. Besides, you've got to admit that Mia is pretty hot." When she said that, I couldn't help but remember how Mia had looked in her bikini before dawn and I had left to go fishing. The idea of being with a new woman after so many years suddenly sounded very appealing. Still, I wanted to be sure about Felicia's feelings. "Corazon, are you sure? We're having a wonderful weekend together, and I'd be perfectly happy to concentrate all my time and attention on you," I said, taking her hands in mine. "Let's do it," she said, squeezing my hands to emphasize her words. "It'll be an adventure, something to spice things up and bring us closer together. If it turns out we don't like it, we don't have to do it again." I could see that her mind was made up, and, to be truthful, the more I thought about Mia, the more interested I became. The way she pressed herself against me when we were dancing, and some of the things she said now took on a new light. The fact that such a sexy woman was interested in me certainly was an ego boost. I tried to hide my growing eagerness. "Okay, if that's what you want, let's do it." Needless to say, when we met Don and Mia for dinner, the atmosphere was highly charged. It was immediately obvious that both women had dressed to impress, Felicia in red and Mia in black. Both dresses did more than just hint at the delights lying underneath. When we were shown to our booth at the restaurant, Felicia sat with Don and Mia slid in next to me. In no time I felt Mia's slim fingers on my knee, and I was pretty sure that Don and Felicia were similarly active. We were all somewhat giddy, and the waiter must have guessed that something was going on, although we tried to be discreet. By the time dinner was over, I was ready to take things to the next level, but the ladies wanted to go dancing first, and Don and I reluctantly agreed. The band that night was playing mostly slow jazz, and the dancing turned into foreplay with music. As we clung together, then she proceeded to rub herself against me in a delightfully lascivious manner. At one point I glanced over at Don and Felicia and saw that they were similarly occupied. Finally, the two ladies decided to visit the powder room together, and Don and I sat down at our table to finish our drinks. He leaned over, handed me his card key, and said quietly, "Why don't you and Mia use our cottage tonight, and Felicia and I will go to your room. Tomorrow, we can all meet up for breakfast at 9 o'clock in the dining room." I nodded, gave him my key, and took the last sip of my mojito. Just then the two ladies returned, laughing and looking at us with fiery eyes. "I think it's time to go," Mia said, taking my hand. I looked over to catch Felicia's eye. "Have fun, Corazon," I said, and she grinned at me. "You too, Andy." As Mia and I walked over to her beach cottage, we clung to each other like amorous teenagers, whispering and snickering at each other's innuendos. But when we got inside, Mia turned into a tigress. She virtually dragged me into the bedroom, frantically pulling at my clothes, unbuckling my belt and yanking ineffectually at my shirt buttons. We had wild sex. At one point I lost the capacity for rational thought. Now it was pure carnal instinct, determined to drive my seed into this female as deep, as hard and as fast as I possibly could. I heard her scream out her climax, but nothing could have stopped me then, and I kept pounding into her until I climaxed as well. Then I collapsed onto her and rolled to the side so I wouldn't crush her. I was asleep almost instantly. When I awoke, the moon had gone down and the only light came from the stars shining through the skylight. At first, I wondered what had awakened me, but then I felt a feminine tongue licking at my chest. "You're going to kill me, Mia," I groaned, but she just chuckled playfully. What a terrible fate, drilled to death. Then she continued her ministrations. Then we were climbing that long stairs together, racing to see which of us could get to the top first. This time it was a tie, and we both cried out in triumph as we tumbled back down in satisfied exhaustion. The next thing I knew, Mia was shaking me. "Wake up, lover. We're going to be late for breakfast." I groggily rolled out of bed and began pulling my somewhat rumpled clothes on. As we walked over to the main building, she looped her arm through mine. "You were wonderful last night, Andy. We've got to do that again sometime." "Most definitely, Mia," I told her. But the truth was that now that our little orgy was over, I was beginning to feel anxious about Felicia, wondering how her night had been, wondering how the two of us were doing. Sex with Mia had been great, but now I needed to see how my wife felt. When we got to the restaurant, Felicia and Don were already seated. "Hello, sleepyhead," Felicia said with a smile. "We were beginning to wonder if you'd ever get up. I even went ahead and ordered breakfast for you." She leaned over and gave me a quick kiss. "Did everything go okay for you last night?" I asked quietly. She nodded. "It was fine. How about you?" "It was good," I told her. "Maybe we can talk about it later." "Sure," she said, "but you'd better get something to eat first. You look exhausted." I grinned sheepishly and dug into breakfast. As we ate, we talked about plans for the day. Mia wanted to take Felicia and me out on the boat. Don couldn't join us because he had to go into the little office his company kept in Crystal River to take part in a conference call. But he urged us to go ahead without him. "Mia's as good a sailor as I am. She's been out in the cruiser without me lots of times," he said. The weather was perfect, so another boat ride sounded good to me, and watching two beautiful women in bikinis wouldn't be hard to take either. Accordingly, Felicia and I headed back to our room to get changed. But as we rode up in the elevator, I felt myself getting sleepier and sleepier. When I kept yawning, Felicia laughed at me. "Mia must have really worn you out last night," she said with amusement, and I had to confess that I hadn't gotten much sleep. "Why don't you lie down and take a little nap?" Felicia suggested. "It looks like you really need one. Mia and I can go without you." I really wanted to go with them, but I could hardly keep my eyes open. I flopped down on the bed and closed my eyes. Felicia kissed me on the cheek and headed out the door. "I'll put the do not disturb sign out," she told me. "Sleep well, Andres." The next thing I heard was a pounding on the door and a voice shouting, "Mr. Salazar, Mr. Salazar, are you in there?" I struggled to sit up as the pounding continued. "Hold on," I yelled. "I'll be right with you." "What time is it?" I asked myself, and when I glanced at the clock on the bedside table, I was shocked to see that it was almost 4 p.m. How can that be? I wondered. The pounding resumed, regaining my attention. Shaking my head to try to clear it, I got to my feet and walked unsteadily to the door. When I unlocked it, I saw a hotel employee with an urgent expression on his face. "We've been looking all over for you, Mr. Salazar. We kept ringing your room, but no one answered." "I must have been sound asleep," I said. "What is it? Why are you looking for me?" He tugged on my sleeve, half dragging me toward the elevator. "There's been an accident," he said breathlessly. "You have to come now." His words sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, and I finally began to come fully awake. But despite my repeated questions, the man could tell me no more than that there'd been an accident and that I had to come with him. When we got to the main floor, he led me outside where a knot of uniformed men were standing. "I found him," the employee yelled. "I found Mr. Salazar." "What's happened?" I asked frantically. "What's going on?" A man in a Coast Guard uniform pointed out toward the Gulf. At first, as I peered into the distance, I couldn't make anything out, but then I spotted what appeared to be a helicopter circling a faint plume of smoke. "I don't understand," I choked out as fear tightened my throat. Another officer held up an iPad. I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at, but it appeared to be a video. "That's a live feed from the chopper," the man said, and I stared in horrified fascination at a picture of burning wreckage floating on the sea. It appears there was an explosion and fire. "What kind of boat was it?" I asked fearfully. "As best we can tell, it was a Chris-Craft hardtop cruiser," he said, and my knees went weak. I swallowed and tried to form my next question carefully. "What about survivors? Have they made any rescues?" He looked at me sadly. "The chopper hasn't spotted any life preservers, and the diver they lowered hasn't found any bodies in the water." Then, perhaps seeing the expression on my face, he added, "But we'll have a boat up from the Marine Safety Office in Tampa momentarily, and they'll be able to conduct a more thorough search." Unbidden, the memory of the Mako shark flashed through my mind. I shuddered and tried to wipe the image from my imagination. "What could have done that?" I asked, pointing at the feed coming from the chopper. "It looks like a bomb went off." The officer shook his head. "We see things like this happen all too frequently. Something goes wrong in the boat's engine compartment, and it fills up with fumes. Then when somebody tries to restart the engine, there's an explosion. We lose a lot of boaters that way. Just then his radio crackled and he stopped to talk. When he finished, he turned back to me. Our cruiser is on the scene now to continue the search. There's nothing you can do now. Why don't you go back and wait in your room so we'll be able to find you if we have more news? I didn't want to leave, but I didn't want to stay there either. So I turned to go back inside. Behind me I heard someone say in a quiet voice, "Poor man." And my heart sank even lower. If the professionals were that pessimistic, what hope did I have? I spent the rest of the afternoon waiting, but the call I was praying for never came. After a while I began making my own calls, first to my office to let them know that I wouldn't be in on Monday, then to my sister, and finally the one I'd been dreading the most, Felicia's parents. It was awful. Later there was a knock at the door, and when I anxiously yanked it open, I saw a waiter with a tray of food. "The manager thought you might like to have something to eat, sir," he told me. I tipped the man and asked him to thank the manager for his thoughtfulness. But even though I'd had nothing to eat since breakfast, I had no appetite and could only nibble on the food they'd provided. Every few minutes I'd get up and wander over to the balcony to look out at the Gulf. Though it was now dark, I kept hoping I'd see the lights of the helicopter, or perhaps a rescue boat headed our way. But each time there was nothing. Between my anxiety and the long nap I'd taken earlier, there was no way I could get to sleep. So to give myself something to do, I began to pack up some of our bags. When I bent down to pick something off the floor, I noticed a wisp of lace under the bed. It was a pair of Felicia's panties, and as I picked them up, I saw that the crotch was crusty. Suddenly the memory of last night's sexual games came back to me with full force, and I was overwhelmed with shame. Instead of being with my wife, I'd spent the last night of her life with another woman. That, in turn, made me think of poor, passionate Mia. She was gone and likely dead as well. If only I'd been with them, I might have done something to prevent the accident, or perhaps rescue them. Then a wave of resentment swept over me. If Mia hadn't exhausted me, I'd have been out there with them, and I might have been able to save Felicia. Next my thoughts turned to Don, and I realized that he must be going through the same agony as I. I collapsed on the bed and began to weep, my emotions constantly flickering from guilt to grief, from anger to despair. It was the worst night of my life. As I lay there, I kept remembering details about my life together with Felicia. Both of us had gone to Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton to play soccer on scholarship. That's how we met. She came up to me one day after practice and began talking about tactics. She really looked good in her soccer shorts and jersey, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. We wound up dating our last 2 years of college and getting married right after graduation. I began to understand Felicia better after meeting her family. Her parents, I learned, were fervent anti-communists. Her father's family had owned a sugar plantation in Cuba back when Batista was in power. But after Fidel Castro's revolution swept to power in 1959, the landowners eventually lost their plantation and were forced to work in what had been their own fields. In desperation, her grandparents fled the island in a small boat and arrived penniless in Miami. Felicia's mother was born in Miami and grew up in extreme poverty. She and her husband, Felicia's father, both worked in menial positions to make it possible for Felicia to go to college. As a result, Felicia was absolutely driven to succeed. She told me once when we were dating that after seeing how her grandparents and parents had been forced to live, she had vowed she would never be poor again. That memory made me feel even worse about how our lives together had unfolded. The housing bust of 2008 had been especially hard on Florida, and my thriving construction company suddenly teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. For a while, we had to cease all new construction, and for a couple of years struggled to survive on repair jobs. Felicia and I were forced to sell our own home and move into a small condominium just to get by. I felt like a failure, but Felicia never had a word of complaint. Her support, both emotional and financial, had been critical to our pulling through and starting to grow again. And now I might never get the chance to truly show my love and gratitude to her. I had both slipped away from the church in college, but now in the long night I found myself repeating all the Ave Marias and Pater Nosters of my childhood, asking for a miracle. It was all I had left. I must have dozed off towards morning because I was awakened by a gentle knock on the door. When I rushed to open it, another Coast Guard officer was standing there. For a moment, hope soared within me, but the solemn expression on his face quickly crushed it. "I'm sorry, Mr. Salazar, but the decision has been made to terminate the search for survivors," he said in an emotionless voice. "But you can't do that," I shouted. "It's light now, and it'll be easier to find them. You've got to keep going." He shook his head patiently. "Mr. Salazar, our boats have special radar to search the water surface, And our helicopters have got infrared scanners to look for heat signatures. We've been combing the area all night. If there was anything or anyone to find, we'd have done so by now. I must have had a stubborn expression on my face because he went on. Sir, I've investigated a lot of boat explosions, but this was one of the worst I've seen. It's extremely unlikely that either of the two passengers survived the initial blast and fire. Then, seeing the ashen expression on my face, he reached out to grasp my shoulder. It's also extremely unlikely that either of them suffered. A blast big enough to blow that boat apart, well, it's likely they never felt a thing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to force them to go back out on the water and find my Felicia. I wanted to die myself, but all I did was stand there and stare at the floor. Finally, I looked up at him. "Thank you, officer, for doing all you could," I said. He shook my hand, turned and solemnly walked away. I closed the door and sank down on the floor. I'm not sure how long I lay there, but I was startled to hear another knock at my door. When I opened it, there were two men in uniform outside. "Mr. Salazar?" one of them asked. When I nodded, he asked again, "Andres Salazar?" "Yes," I said, "that's me. Who are you?" He reached in his pocket and pulled out his identification. "We're from the Citrus County Sheriff's Department. We'd like to talk to you about what happened out in the Gulf yesterday." "All right," I said resignedly. "Come on in." This was the last thing I wanted to do right now, but I guess there had to be some kind of official police inquiry. We sat down in the living area of the suite, and the deputy asked, "Where were you when the accident occurred?" I thought the question was an odd one, and I didn't like the way he emphasized the word accident, but I told him I had been in the room between breakfast and about 4 p.m. "That's 6 hours," he said. "What were you doing in your room all that time?" he asked. "I was taking a nap," I told him, my irritation growing. "You must have been partying pretty hard the night before," he said with a smirk. I just stared at him. "Did anyone see you while you were taking a nap?" the deputy asked in a sardonic tone of voice. Keeping myself under control, I managed to respond, "Not that I know of. I was asleep the whole time." "So there's no one who can verify your whereabouts between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Is that correct, Senor Salazar?" he said, stretching out the syllables in a mocking drawl. I stood up abruptly. I'd heard that condescending tone of voice before. It hadn't happened in a long time, but it still had the ability to touch a nerve. South Florida is heavily Latino. In fact, almost 60% of the population of Dade County is Hispanic, with almost half of those foreign-born. But as you move north, that percentage drops precipitously, and, especially in the more rural areas, it isn't uncommon to encounter some of the old prejudices. But that didn't mean I had to accept it. What is this all about? My wife has just died in a terrible accident, and you're asking questions like I'm a suspect in a crime. I said angrily. "You're the one who used the term crime, senor," the other deputy said. That was the last straw as far as I was concerned. "Officers, I know my rights, and I am not going to answer any more questions without legal counsel present," I said firmly. The two men looked at each other. The first one closed his notebook. "I guess you know how this looks, Senor Salazar." "It looks like a U.S. citizen who knows his constitutional rights," I snapped back at him. He shrugged his shoulders, and the two deputies headed for the door. "Very well, then. We'll expect you and your attorney at the Citrus County Sheriff's Office in Inverness tomorrow," he said, and then left. It took me several minutes to calm down. Then I grabbed the phone and called Jose Pascual, my attorney back in Orlando. When I told his secretary who was calling, she put me through immediately. "Andy," he said when he came on the line, "we were all shocked when we heard the news. Please accept my deepest condolences on the loss of your lovely wife. It doesn't take long for bad news to travel," I thought. "That's why I'm calling, Jose. I'm still here at the Paradiso Resort, and I've just had two bigots from the local sheriff's department questioning me like I'm a suspect in a crime. I'm in Anglo country here, and I think I need legal counsel pronto." Jose thought for a moment and then said, "Look, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding, but just in case we need to get you someone local, somebody with standing in the court up there. Let me make some phone calls and I'll get back to you." I thanked him and slumped down in a chair. I could feel my head throbbing. This nightmare was turning worse by the minute. In about an hour, the phone rang, and I eagerly answered. It was Jose. "I have good news and bad news. Let me start with the bad. How well did you know Don and Mia Cavendish?" he asked me. "We only met them this weekend." "Well, Mia Cavendish is the former Mia Reynolds. Her father is one of the richest and most influential men in Marion County. He owns the largest thoroughbred horse farm in Ocala. The bottom line is that none of the major law firms in Central Florida will touch your case. They're all beholding to Mr. Reynolds," he told me. "Mierda." I exclaimed. So what do I do now? Well, the good news is that I found an attorney in Inverness to represent you. Her name is Gina Ellerby. The bad news is she's pretty young and inexperienced, but several people in the area recommended her, he explained. I'm sure she'll be able to get you through this just fine. Okay, I said. If you think she can protect me from the bigots up her, that's good enough for me. Good, he replied, because I've already contacted her office. She's going to meet you there at the resort in the morning, and the two of you can drive over to Inverness to meet with the sheriff's department. I'm sure you, and she will get everything squared away. He paused. And Andy, once again, I am so sorry about your loss. Please let me know if there's anything more I can do to help. Thank you, Jose, I replied with difficulty. My emotions were raw. Any reminder, it seemed, could set them off. The resort management called a little later to tell me that I was welcome to stay another night if I needed to do so, and I thanked them for their generosity. Then I called my office to check on how things were going. Even in this time of grief, I knew that I couldn't neglect the business. Once I was up to date on the projects we had going, I spent the rest of the afternoon in the painful process of arranging for a memorial service for Felicia. I felt I owed it to her friends and family, as well as to her. Then I spent another painful, sleepless night, trying to make sense of what had happened. After breakfast the next morning, I waited in the room for my new attorney to arrive. When I heard a somewhat timid knock on the door, I opened it to reveal a young, fresh-faced woman. "Good morning, Mr. Salazar," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Gina Ellerby, your attorney." As she walked into the room, I couldn't help but stare. Jose had warned me that she was young, but this woman looked like she might have just graduated from high school. She was attractive enough, but she reminded me of one of those pubescent starlets that the Disney Channel seems to churn out like clockwork. She turned around and caught me staring at her. "Is everything all right, Mr. Salazar?" she asked in a high-pitched voice that sounded like a little girl's. "Excuse me," I said, "but do you mind telling me how old you are?" I knew it was rude of me, but I couldn't help myself. Her face turned red and she drew herself up to her full height, although that didn't help much. "I know that I look younger than I am and that I have a childish voice, Mr. Salazar. But I'm 27 years old. I graduated from law school. I passed the bar exam and I have been accepted to practice law in the state of Florida. Now, if that isn't good enough for you, I'll leave and you can find another attorney to represent you," she said hotly. I held up my hands, both to stop her from leaving and in apology for my rudeness. "I'm sorry, Ms. Ellerby. It's just that you took me by surprise. Look, we've gotten off to a bad start. Let's try again. I'm Andres Salazar, but my friends call me Andy. I'd like you to represent me." She took a deep breath and then extended her hand to shake mine. "Apology accepted," she said. "I'd like to call you Andy, and you can call me Gina. I'm looking forward to working with you. Now, Mr. Pasquo gave me a summary of your situation, but I'd like to hear the details from you." "Well," I began, "Felicia and I drove up here on Thursday." "Oh, Andy," she interrupted. "What am I thinking? I'm so sorry about your wife. I meant to say something when I first came in." I nodded. At that point, there wasn't much more to be said except to thank her for her concern. Then I went on with a quick rundown of the events of the weekend, although I didn't talk about our little swap with Don and Mia on Saturday night. Somehow I felt like it would be disloyal to Felicia's memory to talk about that. Gina took notes as I went through my recitation, and when I had finished, it was time to get started on the 30-minute drive over to Inverness. Gina volunteered to drive, and as we headed east on FL 44, she told me that she didn't anticipate a problem. I've already had a look at the Coast Guard report online, and they're showing this as a boating accident. I'm guessing our session today is just routine to close the books on the case. You had the misfortune of encountering a couple of rednecks, but don't worry, they won't try that with me around. I was starting to feel better about having Gina as my attorney. She'd obviously done her homework, and I liked her spirit. When we got to the Inverness Sheriff's Department, it was Sheriff McGee himself who wanted to talk to us. It quickly became obvious that this was not to be a routine session. He began by going over the same questions his deputies had asked about my whereabouts on the day of the accident. I felt very uncomfortable having to admit that there was no way I could prove that I had been in the room all day. "You say you were taking a nap from about 10 o'clock in the morning to almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's a mighty long nap. You must have been pretty tired out from the night before," the sheriff remarked, raising his eyebrows. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. This was an area I'd wanted to avoid. "Well, we'd stayed pretty late at the nightclub dancing," I said. He made a note on his pad. "So how would you characterize your relationship with your late wife, Mr. Salazar?" he asked, catching me off guard. "Good, Sheriff, very good," I said quickly. "I mean, we had our disagreements like every couple does, but we had a great marriage. Gina gave me a sharp look, and I realized that she didn't like the way I'd answered the question. But the sheriff just nodded sagely. So you were a happily married, faithful husband? He asked, and I quickly nodded my agreement. Then why was it, Mr. Salazar, that members of the resort staff saw you leave the nightclub that night in the company of Mia Cavendish rather than your wife? Why was it that you and she retired to her beach cottage and were not seen to re-emerge until the following morning? As I hemmed and hawed, I could see Gina's shocked expression out of the corner of my eye. I realized belatedly how suspicious my efforts to protect Felicia's reputation sounded. The only thing I could do now was to come clean about the whole swinging encounter. Look, Sheriff, Felicia and I had discussed trying to spice up our love life a little, and when the opportunity came up with Don and Mia, we decided to try it. I went on to give him an overview of our encounter, omitting only the details of what Mia and I had done together. When I'd finished, I added, I hope you'll be discreet about this. It would be pretty hurtful to Felicia's parents to learn about this, especially at this time. I'm sure you understand. He didn't respond, but made another note on his pad. Then he shifted gears. Did you and Mrs. Salazar have life insurance policies? He asked. I shook my head. No, we never bought any. I've always thought they were a bad investment. So you had nothing to gain financially if your wife were to pass away unexpectedly? No, absolutely not. I said angrily. Not even the accidental death and dismemberment policy that your wife's employer provided, he asked. Oh, I said in confusion. I forgot about that. Even as I spoke, I could see Gina looking at me in consternation. I guess you must have forgotten about the fact that your wife increased the coverage on that policy to $1 million just last month, the sheriff continued matter-of-factly. Felicia said something about doing that, but I had no idea she'd increased it that much, I said hastily. Even as I spoke, I realized how lame that must have sounded. Again, the sheriff jumped to another topic. Let's go back to Mia Cavendish for a minute. How long had the two of you known each other? This weekend was the first time I'd ever met her, I said quickly. Can you prove that, Mr. Salazar? He shot back. Before I could think of anything to say, Gina jumped in. Come on, Sheriff. You know it's impossible to prove a negative. The sheriff had been on a roll and was clearly annoyed at Gina's interruption. Now see here, little girl, he began. But at his words, Gina's face flushed and she jumped to her feet. The sheriff had also arisen, and Gina stalked over and got right in his face. Sheriff McGee, I am a member of the Bar Association and an officer of the court. You will either treat me with the respect I am due, or I'll have you up on charges. As she spoke, the sheriff involuntarily began to back away from the angry young woman, but she kept moving forward until he was backed against the wall. She got as close as she could to him without touching him, and the 250 pounds man actually seemed intimidated by the tiny woman who might have been half his weight. I think my client has had enough of your badgering and illogical questions for one day, she went on. So unless you intend to arrest him and charge him with a crime, we'll be leaving. If you want to talk to him again, you know where to find me. The sheriff looked over at me with a canny expression. No, you're free to go, Mr. Salazar. You can even go back to Orlando, but don't even think about trying to leave the state of Florida. With that, Gina turned, grabbed me by the arm, and half-dragged me out of the sheriff's office. When we got back on the highway, I turned to look at her. Wow. I said, remind me never to upset you. The way you handled the sheriff. Listen, she snapped. I am this close to resigning your case. Don't you ever lie to me again about anything? I cannot represent you effectively if you do. Gina, I'm sorry, I said humbly. I didn't intentionally lie to you. I was embarrassed about the wife-swapping thing and didn't want to hurt Felicia's reputation, or Mia's either, for that matter. And I honestly didn't know about Felicia upping her insurance at work to $1 million. Please, you've got to believe me. She stared at the road for a while in silence. All right, she said finally. I believe you, but don't keep things like that from me anymore. Then she gave a little smile. Besides, the fact that you and your wife wanted to play games hardly makes you a killer. I'm still convinced that this was all a terrible accident. By then we'd reached the resort, and she pulled into the parking lot to let me out. I know you need to get back to Orlando. I'll take care of things here, and if there are any developments, I'll contact you right away. After I'd checked out of the resort and begun driving back towards Orlando, my thoughts turned to the sad days ahead. The first responsibility I'd have to face was the memorial service, and I knew how difficult that would be for me. 2 days later, I was at my office when the phone rang. It was Jose. Have you seen the Sentinel? He asked. When I told him I hadn't, he said, well, you'd better have a look at the local section. But I warn you, You're not going to like what you see. It looks like somebody did a hatchet job on you. I thanked Jose for the heads up and went to check the online edition. When I clicked on local breaking news, the first headline I saw was Orlando man named a person of interest in wife's death. The story not only contained the details of the explosion, but went on to touch in many of the details the sheriff had covered in our meeting. The reporter had liberally used terms like unexplained absence, possible motive, and sex games. I was outraged. In fury, I called Gina, and when I reached her, I lit into her. The sheriff must have given all this to newspaper to put pressure on me. How can he do something like that? I demanded. Besides, the story is filled with innuendo and speculation. It reads like something out of the National Enquirer, not a respectable newspaper. For that matter, I went on. If the sheriff thinks the explosion wasn't an accident, why isn't Don Cavendish under suspicion? He had more to gain than I did. Forget about Cavendish, Gina told me. He isn't a suspect. The sheriff told me he has an airtight alibi with 6 witnesses. He was on a long conference call the whole time, Gina explained. And the other people on the call all told the sheriff that Don participated throughout. I wasn't satisfied. That doesn't mean anything. Cavendish could have been on a cell phone. He could have been anywhere. Gina sighed. Except he wasn't, Andy. The building where he took the call has security cameras in the hallways. The recording showed Don entering the building before the call began and not leaving until after the time it ended. And before you ask, the windows in the building are fixed. When she heard my grunt of frustration, Gina went on. Andy, I absolutely believe that this was a terrible accident. I think the sheriff is poking around because he's trying to do a thorough job, or maybe he's just watched too many detective shows on TV. Whatever the case, I'm sure this whole thing will be closed soon and you'll be completely exonerated. Maybe, I growled. But in the meantime, I'm being made to look like a wife killer. There was nothing further in the news the next few days, but now I really dreaded the thought of going to the memorial service. Not only would I have to deal with my pain and loss, but now there were all these rumors and suspicions. I wanted to hide, but that would only make me look worse. Besides, I told myself, I owed it to Felicia. The service was as bad as I had feared. The priest's homily held little consolation for me, and the eulogies were excruciating. When it came my turn, I broke down halfway through the words I'd prepared and had to cut it short. As I was trying to recount some of our happier times together, I choked up, and all I could say was, I miss you, Felicia, before leaving the pulpit. Although there had been a good turnout for the service, I noticed that far fewer people came through the reception line afterwards. Instead, many people clumped in little knots, talking quietly among themselves. I could only imagine what they were saying. At one point, I saw Felicia's family standing to one side. Her father gave me a dark stare, and I wished there were something I could say to reassure him that I hadn't harmed his beloved daughter. Then her mother came darting over and gave me a quick hug. We know you loved her, Andres. Once all this blows over, you must come and see us. That made me feel a little better, but I wondered how long it would be until all this blows over. The only other thing I particularly remember about the service was the fact that my whole football team turned out, which really meant a lot to me. The last of the group to come through the line was Domingo, our striker. He was small but quick as summer lightning. He came up and threw his arms around me. Hey Andres, hang in there, hombre. We all know you didn't do nothing. He smiled widely. You're a damned Boy Scout. In all the games we've played, you never even got a red card. I couldn't help but grin as I thanked him. I only wish the others there had the same confidence in me. The week after the memorial service, I was working in my office when Gina Ellerby walked in the door. Gina, what are you doing here? I asked in surprise. I had some information for you, and things have been pretty slow at work for me, so I thought I'd come down to see you in person, if you're not too busy. No, not at all, I said. I'm glad you're here. I just didn't want to inconvenience you. What have you found out? She told me she'd gone to the sheriff and demanded to know how the reporter had gotten the news about the sheriff's investigation. I asked him if he'd taken a second job with the Sentinel, she said, but he denied any involvement. But he did admit that he'd made a recording of the interview and that somebody else could have listened to it, she said. I thought about the 2 deputies and decided that one of them was the likely culprit. I didn't like it, but there wasn't much I could do. The cat was out of the bag, and all I could hope was that my name would be cleared as soon as possible. But when Gina showed up at my office again a week later, my hopes for a quick vindication were soon dashed. The sheriff let me know they'd found some new evidence, she told me, and the expression on her face made it clear that it wasn't favorable. The jerry cans from the Chris Craft washed up on shore, she told me. They had your fingerprints all over them. I shook my head in irritation. Of course they did. That doesn't mean anything, I told her. When Don and I were loading up the boat to go fishing on Friday, I carried the extra fuel on board for him. Of course, my fingerprints would be all over those cans. She nodded. I believe you, Andy. It's just that it doesn't look good. If I were a prosecutor going before a jury, I'd tell them that there are 3 requirements to prove the commission of a crime: motive, means, and opportunity. Felicia's life insurance provides an obvious motive. Your prints on those cans imply you had the means. And the fact that you have no alibi for those 6 hours on the day it happened suggests an opportunity. But I've already explained what happened in all 3 of those circumstances, I protested. I know, she replied, and that's probably why they haven't pressed charges. But I've read cases where a jury convicted on evidence that was not much more solid than that. I looked at her in worry and frustration. This is turning into a nightmare. What will it take to convince people I had nothing to do with this? She thought for a minute. The weakest link in the case is the question of your whereabouts during the day on Sunday. The resort manager told me that the sheriff's people interviewed everyone on staff to see if anyone had spotted you during that time. But they came up empty. Because I was asleep in my room. I shouted. But nobody knows that. I'm stuck with having to prove a negative. Gina began to pace around the room. There must be some way to prove that you never left the room. After a pause, she asked, aren't all the doors in the resort operated by a card key? Wouldn't the resort have a record every time someone entered the room? No, I said, card keys don't work that way. Each door lock is a self-contained unit programmed to respond to a specific code on the card. The code is valid only for that door and only for the length of the guest's stay. But the locks aren't connected to anything. In fact, to change the codes on a lock, you have to insert a special device into it. Then I gulped as an idea hit me. But I recently read an article that described some new systems which actually communicate with a central computer, so the hotel has a record of all the comings and goings. The Paradiso is a brand new, top-of-the-line resort. I wonder if it's possible it has a system like that. It was a faint hope, but it was all I had, so I grabbed the phone and called the resort. The manager remembered my name, and when I explained my query, he began to understand why I was so excited. The Paradiso is state-of-the-art in every aspect, he told me, including our card key system. Why didn't you say something before? I demanded. Truthfully, I've never worked at a hotel that had a system like that before. And with the preview and the formal opening, we've been so busy that I haven't even thought about it. But presumably it's in operation. Let me go check. In a few minutes, he came back on the line. You may be in luck, Mr. Salazar. The system is working, and we do have data going back to the preview weekend on the server. Please guard those records with your life. I implored him. We'll be up to see them as quickly as we can get up there. Gina and I each drove our cars up to Crystal River as fast as we could. If any Florida State Police had been in the area, I'm sure we would have been arrested. Luckily, they must have all been out protecting the tourists, so we both arrived without incident. When we burst into the resort, the manager was waiting for us. He led us back to the area where the computer system was located and pulled out a stack of printouts that he'd made for us. Gina and I stared at them in confusion. Neither of us could make heads or tails out of what we were seeing. Each page represents a different date, the manager told us. Here, he went on, pointing at a column heading, are all the times. The room numbers are on the horizontal axis. The code in the table indicates the status, either open or closed, and whether or not the card key was used. Gina looked at him in confusion. How can a door be opened without a card key? When it's opened from the inside, he explained. He turned over several pages and pointed to a series of lines. Here is the record for the room Mr. Salazar had for our preview weekend. You can see all the comings and goings for each day. And here, he said, turning another page, is the record for that Sunday. As you can see, the door was opened without a card key shortly before 8:30 a.m., presumably when you and your wife went down to breakfast. I shot a glance over at Gina. I didn't want her to enlighten the manager about Don Cavendish being in the room at that time. Here, he went on, you can see that the door was opened by the card key at 9:57 a.m. You were probably returning from breakfast at that time. About 30 minutes later, the door opened without the card key, probably when your wife left the room. After that, you can see that the door was not opened again until 3:56 p.m. I turned to Gina. But that really doesn't help us, I said. I could have left the room with Felicia at 10:30. But Gina was dancing around in excitement. But if you had left then, how could you have gotten back in the room when the bellman found you there at 4 o'clock? Don't you see? You had to be in the room the whole time. This proves you were telling the truth about your whereabouts on Sunday. My eyes widened, and I hugged her. You're a genius, Gina, I said. Then I turned to the manager. May we have these? I asked, and he told me he'd printed them out just for us. With the printout in hand, we rushed to the sheriff's office in Inverness. Sheriff McGee was just leaving when we pulled into the parking area. Gina opened her car door and ran over, waving the printout in her hand. "Sheriff, Sheriff," she yelled, "we have the proof." He got out of his car and she spread the papers out on the hood. Eagerly, she explained what they were and what they showed. The sheriff looked at the printouts suspiciously, but he seemed to follow what we were trying to explain about the resort's card key system. Gina pressed hard. "This proves that Andy was in his room the whole time. There's no way he could have left without leaving a record. Don't you see? This proves the explosion was just a terrible accident, nothing more." The sheriff peered at the printout for a few minutes, then gathered up the pages and tucked them into his car. "I'll have to look at these more closely, and I'll want to talk to the resort manager too." He got into the driver's seat and turned on the ignition. Then he rolled down the window. "If this holds up," he said grudgingly, "you've done well, little girl." This time, Gina was so pleased that she didn't even react. As the sheriff drove off, she spun around and embraced me. "I think we've done it," she said. I hugged her back. "You're a genius, Gina," I repeated. "This calls for a celebration. Let me take you out to dinner. You name the place." Gina took us to the McLeod House Bistro, a 100-year-old home in Inverness that had been converted into a restaurant. We had a leisurely meal out on the deck under the awning, and as we ate, I took the opportunity to get to know more about Gina. I found out that she'd gone to a second-rate law school here in Florida. If she'd earned any honors such as law review or moot court, she didn't mention them. She'd passed the bar on her second attempt, she admitted, but had had no luck landing a position with a law firm. But she didn't give up easily, as I'd already discovered. So she hung out her shingle and went into practice on her own. She told me it had been a real struggle to make it for the first year or so, but someone must have given her a good recommendation because she began to pick up all the legal work connected with the development of the new resort outside Crystal River. I was, she sheepishly admitted, her first criminal case. Her personal life was equally unremarkable. There was a boyfriend, apparently, but she hadn't seen him in quite a while and didn't want to talk about him. In the meantime, it was clear that she didn't have a lot of disposable income, so she didn't get out much. She hadn't made that many friends in Citrus County, so she led a pretty solitary life. As I listened, I concluded that she wasn't the sharpest attorney I'd ever met. In addition, I felt her girlish looks and little girl voice were serious handicaps, making it just that much more difficult for potential clients to take her seriously. But she was eager, honest, and determined, all virtues I admired. More importantly, it looked like her persistence had helped uncover the evidence that would get me out of Sheriff McGee's crosshairs. And, I had to admit, she was really cute and perky, even if she did look more like a college freshman than a practicing attorney. I liked her and felt sorry for her at the same time. After dinner, I told her I had to start back to Orlando, but she begged me to follow her over to her place for a cup of coffee. "It'll help keep you awake for the drive back," she said, and I yielded because I really felt indebted to her. When we got back to her place, she wanted to give me a quick tour which wound up in her bedroom. I half expected to see posters of boy bands on her walls. There weren't, thank goodness. But she did have a teddy bear on her bed. As I turned to walk back to the living room, she caught my hand and stopped me. "Andy," she said very solemnly, "I want you to fire me." I was shocked. "Why, Gina? I don't understand." She gave me a shy smile. "Because if you don't, it would be a breach of legal ethics for me to do this." With that, she pulled me to her, stood up on tiptoe, and kissed me passionately on the lips. I hadn't been with a woman since Mia Cavendish, and Gina was definitely desirable, but I made myself stop and push her away slightly. "Gina, are you sure? What about your boyfriend? What about—" But she put her fingers to my mouth to stop me. "It's okay," she said breathlessly. "I really want this." Then she was back in my arms again, and I stopped resisting. She reached over to flick off the light switch, then pulled me to the bed and began frantically undressing me. When she saw that I was trying to help, she hastily began stripping off her own clothes, tossing items in all directions. Then we were on the bed, urgently kissing and exploring each other. After 10 minutes, she squealed like a child at the top of her lungs, just as I grunted and reached my own peak. Then I collapsed on her and rolled onto my side, clutching her to me, stroking her back. When our breathing had returned to normal, a sudden worry crossed my mind. "Gina, I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I didn't even think to ask you about protection." "It's okay," she replied. "I'm on the pill, and since neither one of us has been with anyone for a long time, I expect we're safe that way too." Then she kissed me and closed her eyes. After a minute or two, I closed mine as well and was soon asleep. Sometime later, I felt her shift in my arms, and when I looked over, I saw her looking at me shyly. She put her lips to my ear. "Do you think we could do that again?" I ran my hand over her body. "Yes," I said with a smile. "I think we can." She kissed me and then said in her little girl's voice, "But this time, please be slow and gentle with me. I think I'm going to be sore in the morning." I tried to do just that, but she was still wild. At breakfast the next morning, she was obviously happy, humming to herself, even stopping to do a little dance move for my benefit. I was glad she wasn't feeling any guilt about our night together. She gave me a self-satisfied smile. "So how does it feel to be out from under suspicion of your wife's death?" The look on my face must have caused her to realize how that sounded, and she began to apologize, but I stopped her. "It's all right, Gina. I knew what you meant, but the truth is I'm still concerned about what really did happen out there." Sheriff McGee seemed so convinced that a crime had been committed, and I'm wondering if he was right. "Oh, Andy, you can't let that eat away at you. It was just a tragic accident, like the Coast Guard report said." "Maybe," I said, "but the fact remains that Don Cavendish stood to gain a lot of money from his wife's death, and it seems just a little too convenient that he had such a perfect alibi set up at just the right time with witnesses who weren't even in the same location. Do you realize how paranoid that sounds?" Gina asked impatiently. The cameras at Don's office showed him arriving at the office and staying there until the conference call ended, well after the explosion. "Do you know where that office building is located?" I asked. "I'd like to go take a look at it." Gina rolled her eyes, but she agreed to drive me over there. When we got to the address, I saw the nondescript two-story commercial structure that offered a series of office suites for rental. With Gina reluctantly in tow, I walked around the building. The place had only two entrances, one in the front and one in the rear. The two were connected by a long hallway. Fixed commercial windows provided light. There appeared to be no other point of egress. We went back to the front entrance and entered the lobby. A display board showed that Don Cavendish and Association had a suite at the rear of the back of the building. Just then a security guard came out of one of the suites and approached us. "Can I help you folks?" he asked. Gina started to speak, but I grabbed her hand. "My colleague and I are looking for office space. By any chance, is there an unleased office we could look at to see if these would meet our needs? We'd really appreciate it." "Sure," he said. "There's no one in 115. Come on, I'll let you in." As we followed the guard down the hall, Gina gave me a sharp look, but I ignored it. The friendly watchman unlocked the door and held it open for us. "Feel free to look around all you want. When you leave, the door will lock automatically." Then he went on to complete his rounds. The office space was unremarkable, and Gina asked, "What are we looking for?" "I don't know," I said. "I'll know it when I see it." We walked through a small reception area back into one of the offices. It had a floor-to-ceiling window with blinds embedded between the panes of glass. I stepped over to the window and bent down to examine it more closely. When I read the logo on the little decal I found on the lower right-hand corner of the window frame, I jumped up in excitement and turned back to Gina. "I know this manufacturer," I told her. "I've used their windows in one of my projects." "So," she replied, "what's the significance of that?" I pointed at her purse. "Do you by chance have a pair of nail clippers?" She did, and when she handed them to me, I walked over to the window and pointed to a small opening in the lower left-hand corner. "The building superintendent will have a special key for this, but the manufacturer's rep showed me how to do this if you lose the key." With that, I bent down, inserted the nail file attachment of the clippers into the slot, and twisted. When I heard a click, I stood up, put my hand on the edge of the side of the window, and pushed. The window promptly pivoted open, one edge rotating outside the building, the other rotating into the office. Gina gasped. I smiled in triumph. "It's called a center pivot window. It allows the cleaning staff to wash both sides of the window without having to go outside, which is a real advantage for the upper floors. But it also makes it possible for someone on the main floor to slip out of the building without using the hallway." I closed the window and relocked it. Handing her nail clippers back to her, I took her arm. "Come on, we've got to try to find the sheriff." "Wait," Gina shouted so abruptly that I froze. "Andy, think about what you're doing. What are you going to tell the sheriff? That it would have been physically possible for Don Cavendish to leave this building without being seen. Okay, but you have no evidence that he actually did so. And you have no evidence that he somehow made it out to the boat and set off an explosion. In fact, you have no evidence that anything happened other than the terrible accident that the Coast Guard report shows. Look," she went on, "the sheriff didn't arrest you because the circumstantial evidence wasn't strong enough. He's certainly not going to arrest a prominent business leader from Ocala on even weaker evidence." She took my arm. "Andy, I know you're upset about your wife and resentful of the accusations made about you, but you're going to look even worse if you go off half-cocked about a murder. It was an accident. Just let it go. I knew there was a lot of truth in what she was saying, but my gut kept telling me I wasn't wrong. I looked up at Gina. All right, I'll stay away from Sheriff McGee for now, but I want to go talk to Cavendish and hear what he has to say. Gina looked down at the floor. You can't do that, Andy, she said quietly. Why not? I demanded. Because he's left town, she said. I tried to reach him to get some information, she explained, and his office told me he'd left Ocala and would be gone indefinitely. You see, I shouted. I knew he had something to hide. She looked at me sadly. Andy, go back to Orlando. Take care of your business, try to restart your life. If you'll just accept the fact that Felicia died in a tragic accident, you'll be a lot happier. Then she came up to me and kissed me gently. Please, Andy, I really care about you. I don't want to see you waste your life consumed by conspiracy theories. As I drove back toward Orlando, my mind was still churning. Despite what Gina had said, it seemed to me there were way too many coincidences for this to have been an accident. Cavendish just happened to have had a conference call that prevented him from going out on the boat. But the call was with colleagues out of town who could only confirm he was on the call, not that he was in his office. And then there were those jerry cans of gasoline. Don just happened to pick up the beer cooler, so I'd have to carry the cans and get my fingerprints all over them. And Mia had just happened to keep me going all night, so that I was exhausted the next day. No, wait, that couldn't be right. That would mean Mia had been involved in her own death. I shook my head wearily. I just couldn't put all the pieces together. Maybe Gina was right. Maybe I just needed to let it go. I threw myself into my work the next week. I had a lot to do anyway, but I also hoped that focusing on my business would get my mind off what had happened. To an extent, it worked, but at night I'd find myself drawing diagrams and plotting timelines, trying to come up with a reasonable scenario. I was just finishing up a project late on Thursday afternoon when I heard someone come into my office. Looking up, I was astonished to see Gina standing there in a pretty dress, holding something behind her back. Gina, I said, what are you doing here? She brought her hand in front of her to reveal a bottle of champagne. I'm here to celebrate with you, she said with a smile. The sheriff formally closed his investigation on the explosion. It's officially considered an accident at sea. You're off the hook, Andy. I came around the desk to stand beside her. That's good news, Gina. I really appreciate all you've done for me. Then I took the champagne bottle out of her hands and set it on my desk. Taking her hands in mine, I looked at her carefully. What's going on, Gina? Why are you really here? The too cheerful smile dropped from her face to be replaced by a more serious expression. I wanted to see you again, Andy. Don't worry, I'm not in love with you. But the two of us have a lot in common. We're lonely, we've both lost loved ones. She looked up at me with a shy smile. And we're both horny. I'll leave if you want me to, but I thought we could help each other out, just for a night. I thought about what she'd said and realized that she was right. I wasn't going to fall in love with her, especially not so soon after losing Felicia. But I really didn't have anyone to help me get through the loneliness, and, if I were honest with myself, I was horny and I smiled at her. I have an idea. Why don't you come to my place and I'll fix dinner for the two of us? Her happy smile made me glad I'd made the offer. While Gina wandered around my condo sipping champagne, I set to work preparing dinner. I'm not a great chef, but I make a mean shrimp in garlic sauce with black beans and rice. I had some peeled shrimp in the refrigerator that I butterflied while the grill heated up. Gina helped me by mashing the garlic into a paste for the mojo. I cheated on the black beans, opening a can from the store, but with the spices, onions, and peppers they still tasted fine. By the time everything was ready, we were both really hungry, and we made short work of the meal. I deliberately kept the conversation away from the events that had brought us together in the first place, especially avoiding mentioning my suspicions about Don Cavendish. That would only set off an argument, and I didn't want any conflicts. Everything seemed to be going well until after dinner when I made the mistake of asking Gina how her law practice was going. Her face fell, and I realized belatedly that getting away from the office was probably one of the reasons that she'd driven all the way to Orlando. She tearfully told me that the work she'd been getting from the resort had dried up and that she was having trouble making ends meet. I also suspected that she hadn't heard from her boyfriend, and their relationship, or lack thereof, was taking a toll on her. There wasn't much I could say to encourage her, but I held her and tried to be supportive. After a while, she looked up and gave me a little kiss of gratitude. A moment later, I saw another emotion rise in her eyes, and she kissed me again, this time with real passion. Then she squirmed around to straddle my lap, kissing me frantically as she started to pant. Her excitement was infectious, and I found myself responding in similar fashion. I picked her up and carried her into my bedroom, where we both began to pull at each other's clothes. Just like the last time, sex between us was hurried, needy, and ultimately very satisfying. We both drifted off to sleep and didn't awaken until the early morning hours. Once again, she pulled me to her, and I was happy to oblige. I might not be in love with her, but she was a sweet and sexy woman. I couldn't help but care about her. As we lay there in bed afterwards, she sat up and got a serious look on her face. "There's something I have to tell you," she said, and I tensed, wondering what was coming. She looked almost embarrassed. "I think I know where Don Cavendish is," she said. "Where?" I demanded, sitting up in bed, my heart rate accelerating. I went over to the resort to see if they had any work for me, and in the office I spotted a package in the outgoing mail with Don's name on it. The address was in Lake Tahoe. "I wrote it down for you." I started to get out of bed, but she grabbed my arm. "There's something else," she said, "but I'm not sure what it means." I found out that Don's business is a major investor in the Paradiso. I started getting dressed. I don't know the significance either, but I do know that I'm going to Tahoe. I have to get to Cavendish and find out what really happened. "Wait," Gina said. "I want to come with you." "No," I said sharply. "This is my concern, not yours. Besides, if what I suspect is right, it could get dangerous. You need to go back to Inverness. I'll let you know what I find out." She reluctantly agreed and soon left. I called my office to let them know I wouldn't be in, then started checking flights to Lake Tahoe. My best bet was a Southwest flight to Reno that left at mid-morning. I hurried to get to the airport on time. When my flight finally arrived at Reno Tahoe International, I discovered that I'd made one strategic oversight. I'd failed to check the weather. An early snowstorm had blanketed the entire area. For a guy who had lived his whole life in sunny Florida, this was a real problem. Nevertheless, I vowed that I wouldn't be intimidated. Lots of other people had adapted to the snow. I just have to do it too. Luckily, I was able to rent a four-wheel drive vehicle at the airport and paid the extra for a set of chains. Then I set out to do a little shopping in Reno. When I finished my errands, it was getting pretty late. So I found an inexpensive motel and settled in with some takeout food. I figured it would be smarter to set out for Lake Tahoe in the morning light. After breakfast, I headed south on I-580, then turned west on Nevada 431. The roads had been plowed and the traffic had melted most of the remaining snow, so I made pretty good time. When I came to Galena Creek Park, I pulled in and put the chains on the tires because the snow was getting thicker on the road as the elevation increased. Mount Rose Highway was a nightmare. Heavy snow, sharp turns, and a constant climb. I wondered about all the tall red poles along the side of the highway until I realized they were there to guide the snowplows. My God, I thought, does the snow really get that deep? Finally, I began to make the descent down to Lake Tahoe. In some ways, the downhill drive was even scarier because I knew that if I lost traction, there were many stretches where I could wind up in the icy lake. But finally, I pulled safely into South Lake Tahoe in the early afternoon. It had taken me 3 hours to drive 40 miles. I was worn out, so I pulled into the Mont Bleu, one of the first major casino hotels I came to. Once I had checked into a room and rested for a bit, I took my rental SUV and drove out to scout the address Gina had given me for Cavendish's place. The GPS system led me up a hillside road until I came to a Swiss-style chalet with a spectacular view of the lake. My builders told me the place had to be almost 10,000 square feet, which made it the largest chalet I'd ever seen. But with more snow falling and the light fading fast, I didn't want to risk making a mistake in the dark and getting discovered, or worse. So I headed back to the Mont Bleu. Once there, I went to the Zone and had a burger and beer while watching football on the big screen TV. They were showing the Miami game, and it gave me a good feeling to see the Hurricanes whip up on an SEC rival. After the game, I decided to check out the casino before going up to my room. Despite the weather, there were lots of people there. As I walked through the area, I glanced over at the blackjack table and nearly gasped out loud. There was Don Cavendish, and from the size of the stack of chips in front of him, he seemed to be doing pretty well. For that matter, judging by the tall, long-haired blonde standing behind him, he was doing pretty well in that area as well. She was hot enough to be a hooker, but you never know. Guys with his kind of money seem to attract attractive women like sugar attracts ants. I didn't want to confront him there, so I stepped behind a group of people and watched. After a while, he scooped up his winnings, and he and his companion headed for the cashier's window. Stick to the plan, I told myself. Wait till tomorrow. With that, I headed back upstairs to my room, but sleep didn't come easily. Actually, seeing Cavendish again brought back a swarm of painful memories. At the same time, I kept wondering what tomorrow might bring. I'm not sure when I drifted off to sleep, but I know it was late. After grabbing a quick breakfast the next morning, I went back up to my room to prepare for the encounter. In Reno, I'd gone to a sporting goods store and bought a combination of skiing and climbing gear that the salesman swore would keep me warm. I figured I'd need all of it. The other thing I'd done in Reno was to visit a gun show I'd learned about on the internet. When he found out I was from Florida, the small gun dealer I met at the show told me I'd have to place an order and wait to get the automatic I wanted to buy. But I told him I was eager to do some target shooting that weekend, and an extra $100 persuaded him to ignore the requirement. He even threw in a box of ammunition. With the automatic in my pocket, I packed my bags and checked out of my room. I figured that I wouldn't be coming back to the casino, one way or another. I'd been in a somber mood as I was getting ready. When I went outside and saw how much snow had fallen overnight, my mood got even darker. I carefully drove back up to where Cavendish's Airy was perched, thankful for the chains on my tires. I decided to park down around a bend in the road so he wouldn't spot my SUV. I didn't see any tire tracks on the road. Assuming Cavendish had gone home last night, he must still be there. The smoke I spotted rising from his chimney gave me even more confidence that my timing was good. Despite being only 100 yards, the hike up the hill to his house was difficult in the snow. I was panting by the time I reached his place and crouched behind some trees. The house's security system looked like a good one, but after working in construction, I knew something about how they're installed and how to breach them without triggering an alarm. It only took me a couple of minutes work with the pry bar and screwdriver I'd brought along. Then I took a deep breath. It was time. The window that I jimmied opened into what appeared to be an unoccupied guest bedroom. Even better, the carpet on the floor muffled my footsteps. I eased open the door and looked out into a long hallway. Light came from one end, so I headed in that direction. As I neared the end of the carpeted hallway, I spotted Cavendish sitting at the dining room table going over some papers. But as I stepped into the great room, the floorboard creaked and his head shot up. He sprang to his feet, but I leveled the automatic at him and ordered him to stay where he was. When I got close enough for him to see me clearly, his face relaxed into an insolent grin. Well, Andy Salazar. You're the last person I'd expect to see here. Give it up, Cavendish, I snarled at him. I know you blew the boat up, and I know how you did it. He just stared at me, so I pressed on, trying to shake his confidence. The conference call was easy. With a cell phone, you could have taken that call from anywhere and your colleagues would never know. Figuring out how you spoofed the video from the office building was trickier until I went over there and saw the center pivot windows. Not many people realize how easy they are to open if you know the trick. I saw a flicker in his eyes and I thought I might be getting to him. Getting out to the yacht must have been a cinch. You probably had a motorboat waiting for you. No, he said arrogantly. It was a ski-doo, even faster and easier to conceal. And since I had on a wetsuit, no one recognized me. But why did you do it? You already had a fortune. How much is enough? Now it was his turn to display an angry scowl. That's where you're wrong, Salazar. All the money was in Mia's name. She insisted on a prenup when we married, and she used it to keep me on a short leash. I wanted her dead almost as much as I wanted her money. Then his smile was back and even bigger than before. Of course, the money wasn't the only thing I wanted. At that moment, I felt the pressure of a gun barrel against my neck. You'll live a lot longer if you put that gun down on the floor, a voice whispered behind me. With a feeling of despair, I stooped and set my automatic on the floor. Kick it away, came the command, and I used my foot to slide it away from Cavendish. At least he wouldn't have it at hand. The gunman backed away from me and began to circle around the room, winding up beside Cavendish. When I saw the long blonde hair, I swore at my own stupidity. Erda. I never thought that she might still be here. Cavendish was grinning from ear to ear. You still don't get the picture, do you, Andy? He nudged the blonde, and she reached up to her scalp with her other hand and began fiddling with her hair. After a minute, she grasped her golden curls and pulled them completely off her head, revealing short black hair and a pixie cut. Oh my God, Felicia! I gasped, almost staggering at the sight. She grinned at Cavendish. See, Dawn, I told you it was a good disguise. I was in shock. You were a part of this all along? I asked in disbelief. She gave me a triumphant look. Who do you think put a double dose of Ambien in your breakfast on Sunday morning? Who do you think hiked up her life insurance to create a motive for you? Who do you think put more Ambien in the cocktail I mixed for that bitch Mia, so she wouldn't give us any trouble when Don came out to the boat? Cavendish was boasting now. It was so easy. By the time I got to the yacht, Mia was out cold, so it was no trouble to weigh her down and dump her over the side. Then I rigged the engine compartment in Felicia, and I got the hell out of there. I dropped her off in a cove where we had a car waiting. then came back to Crystal River and slipped in the building with no one the wiser. The explosion explained the missing women, and the evidence against you kept suspicion off me. Trying to get my head around what they were saying, I babbled. But that means all this must have been going on. Oh, yes, my dear husband, Felicia interrupted me. We fell in love soon after I started handling PR for the Paradiso. When Don told me about his problem with Mia, we began looking for ways to deal with her. We figured an accident at sea was the perfect way to get rid of her and let me disappear at the same time, she said smugly. Oh, she added, and the sneak preview was my idea. It worked great to get you up to the resort where we could pull everything off. I was stunned. But why, Felicia? Why would you do such a thing? I thought we were happy together. You were so loving to me at the resort. How could you do this? Her face flushed and her eyes took on a wild look. In an almost manic voice she screamed, "You know why? I told you before. I will never be poor again." I staggered backwards at her vehemence. I had never realized just how deeply her childhood had warped her character. Felicia seemed to regain her composure, and she slid over and put an arm around Cavendish. In a calmer voice she went on, "Now that Mia is out of the way and everyone thinks I'm dead, we'll never have to worry about money again. I love him, and we can be together forever." "Really?" A voice screamed out from the hallway, and I looked around in astonishment to see Gina standing there. The pink snowsuit she was wearing made her look very young, but the pistol she was holding was the real thing. Felicia's gun wavered back and forth between me and the girl, as though she couldn't decide who was the greater threat. Tears were streaming down Gina's face. "It's not true," she yelled at Felicia. "Don loves me. He promised me he was going to divorce Mia, and we could be together." I gaped at her. "Don was your boyfriend?" But her attention was focused solely on Cavendish. "You told me you loved me. You promised me." Cavendish's sneer was back. "Did I say I loved you, Gina? I'm afraid I was using a little poetic license. But you came on to me. You made promises," Gina protested, sobbing now. "Oh, my dear. You should know by now that men will say anything to seduce a nubile young woman. While I enjoyed our dalliance, what I really wanted was your skills, or lack thereof, as an attorney. I kept you in business with the legal work for the Paradiso, so you'd be around to represent good old Andy after I made sure no other attorney would. I figured that after the way you botched the work for the Paradiso, you'd wind up getting our boy here convicted on circumstantial evidence. But you couldn't even do that, right? Could you? No, you're just a stupid, immature little girl." At that, Gina's anguish turned to rage, and she screamed out, "Don't call me a little girl." I guess she must have inadvertently squeezed the trigger, because there was a thunderous boom and a red blossom opened up in the center of Don Cavendish's chest. He touched the blood and looked at it with astonishment, then sank to his knees and pitched over onto his face. Felicia screamed and fired off a shot that hit Gina in the shoulder, spinning her around. The second bullet buried itself in Gina's back and knocked her down. I didn't think she'd get up from that one. Felicia turned and knelt beside Don, crying and shaking him. I figured this was my only chance, and I began running towards her. Felicia must have heard my footsteps because she rose, whirled, and snapped off a shot at me. But she was too late. I was already sliding across the floor in a football tackle. As I slid into her, my heavy boots lashed out, striking the side of her knee. Her face took on a startled look as she flipped up into the air, coming down heavily on her shoulder, her head striking the floor hard enough to stun her. I scrambled to my feet and kicked the pistol away from her. As she regained her senses, the pain from her ruined knee must have hit her because she howled in agony and clutched at her leg. I saw the awkward angle at which it was bent, and I figured that the very best she could hope for was a torn ACL. I knew she wasn't going to be walking on it anytime soon. I rushed over to Gina to see if I could help, but there was no pulse at her neck or wrist, so I let her crumpled body slump back to the floor. Poor little Gina, what a damned shame, I thought sadly. I came back over to Felicia and stood looking down at her. Through her tears, she reached up to clutch at my pants leg. "Help me, Andy," she begged. "Help me, Corazon." I yanked my pants from her grasp. "It's far too late for that, Puta," I said with a sneer. Then I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911. After I'd given the operator the address, I told her she'd better send the police as well as an ambulance. "There's been a double homicide," I said, and assured her that I'd be waiting to let them in the house. Then I sat down in front of the window and looked out at the big flakes of wet snow falling gently over the lake. The scene was beautiful, but I preferred the sand and the ocean. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the miniature audio recording device I'd bought in Reno. It only took a few button clicks to reassure me that it had captured everything that had happened. I set it out on the table to give to the police. Felicia's sobbing distracted me, and I glanced over at her. If this had happened at one of our league games, we'd have wrapped her knee in ice to try to keep the swelling down. Nah, I thought to myself, leave it to the professionals. Thinking about football brought back a memory, and I almost laughed out loud. Domingo, I thought, you were wrong about me being a Boy Scout. That tackle would have earned me a straight red card for sure. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.